The Bento of Bushido. What samurai ate before battle rice, pickles, and honor. The art of the samurai meal. The image most people conjure of a samurai is that of a solemn warrior, armored in lacquered plates, katana glinting in the sunlight, face unreadable. But beneath that helmet, under the layers of discipline and ritual, lived a man who, just like anyone else, got hungry. You are standing in feudal Japan, in the middle of the Edo period, around the mid-1700s. The land is nominally at peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, but tensions simmer constantly. Samurai are not simply warriors. They are bureaucrats, guards, teachers, and poets. They carry the sword, yes, but more often they carry papers, ink brushes, and lunch boxes. These lunch boxes, known as bento, were not mere containers. They were a reflection of class, of discipline, of custom, and of cultural refinement. And what went inside them was just as carefully considered as the blade that hung at the samurai's side. Let us unpack that lunch. Boxed together the rice. White, polished, and purposeful rice was the foundation. But not just any rice. Polished white rice, steamed and carefully packed into a wooden or lacquered box. In feudal Japan, rice was currency literally. Samurai were often paid not in coins, but in koku, a unit representing the amount of rice. That could feed one man for a year. So when you packed your rice into your bento, it was not just food. It was your wealth, your livelihood, and your social marker. The rice wasn't fluffy and light like the kind you find in modern Japanese cuisine. It was often overcooked on purpose, packed dense to stay warm longer and resist spoilage. On especially warm days, a dash of vinegar might be added not for flavor, but for preservation. A samurai would eat rice with a deep, slow pace. It wasn't simply sustenance, it was a moment to reflect, to steady the mind. You could not rush through rice and expect to maintain composure for a duel. Pickled vegetables. The crunch of preservation. Then came the pickles. Japanese tsukemono pickled daikon radish, umeboshi, sour plum, or cucumber. These items did more than balance the meal. They preserved health. Umeboshi, in particular, was beloved by the samurai for its antiseptic properties. In fact, samurai often believed that a single umeboshi eaten before battle could ward off illness and calm the nerves. Even in death, umeboshi made an appearance. Some samurai were buried with dried plums or pickled roots in tiny silk packet symbols of sustenance for the journey to the next world. But pickles weren't simply health aids. Their preparation was a form of meditation. The slicing, the salting, the fermentation, all processes that required patience. Just like sword practice. Protein. Dried fish and bean cakes, unlike the modern bento. The protein in a samurai's meal was modest. Meat was rare, especially during peaceful Edo times when Buddhist influence discouraged it. More common were slivers of dried fish, often salmon or mackerel, sometimes grilled, but often simply salted, and sun-dash dried. Tofu, too, played a central role. Thick slices of cold tofu were sometimes packed with sesame or miso paste, wrapped in seaweed to keep them fresh. Bean cakes or fried bean curd were also staples. Why not meat? Because a bloated belly does not serve a warrior well. You needed to be agile, light, alert. It was said that warriors trained best on an empty stomach. So their meals were designed to be satisfying without heaviness. Seasonal elements. A reflection of nature, every bento was a mirror of the season. In spring, bamboo shoots and wild herbs like warabi or fuki might find their way into the box. Summer might bring slices of fresh cucumber or salted melon rinds. In autumn, sweet potatoes, roasted chestnuts, or pickled mushrooms would appear. Winter brought hardy roots and dried seaweed. To the samurai, eating in accordance with nature wasn't a poetic luxury. It was discipline. You respected the cycle. of life. You honored the present moment. Some clans even had formal bento guidelines to reflect the 5 traditional tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, as well as the 5 colors: red, green, yellow, white, and black. Each color, each taste, was thought to nourish a different part of the body and soul. This was not a lunchbox. It was a compact philosophy. The box itself, wood, lacquer, and family crests. The bento was often crafted from wood, usually cypress or cedar, or sometimes bamboo. Lacquered boxes were common among higher-ranking samurai, with inlays of gold leaf or family crests etched on the lid. Some had sliding compartments or stacked tiers for larger meals. You might imagine these bento as disposable or purely utilitarian. But that would be a mistake. These boxes were heirlooms, passed down through families, cleaned, polished, wrapped in cloth when carried. Even their smell, the aroma of cedar and soy, was part of the sensory ritual. To open a bento was to begin a meditation, etiquette of eating, silence, respect, and order. Samurai did not eat with chatter. Meals were silent, composed moments. Each bite taken with mindfulness, each utensil held with care. The chopsticks themselves were tools of etiquette. Pointing them, waving them, or stabbing food was considered rude, potentially punishable, depending on context. A careless hand at a meal could indicate a careless hand in battle. Meals were often taken alone or in formal company. To offer a bite from your bento to another was a gesture of deep respect, often reserved for comrades who had fought at your side. Food before battle? What did samurai eat on the eve of death? It's here that the calm becomes poignant. What did a samurai eat knowing he might not live to see the next morning? Sources vary. Some recount warriors fasting before battle to purify the mind. Others describe simple meals of rice balls, dried plum, and water taken in silence. But many accounts describe a deliberate slowness. Samurai eating without haste, savoring each bite, sometimes reciting poetry between mouthfuls. It wasn't about fullness, it was about presence. The final meal was not for the body, it was for the soul. And then the box was closed. The swords were checked. The armor fastened. The lacquered lid clicked into place. A breath was drawn. The bento had done its job. Section 2. The Peacetime Palate. How the samurai's diet changed in the Edo Iryu are now in the heart of the Edo period, perhaps the mid-18th century. Japan has been at relative peace for over a century under the Tokugawa shogunate. The sound of clashing swords has faded into the daily murmurs of commerce, ritual, and administration. The samurai, once the sword-bearing guardians of feudal domains, are no longer warriors in practice, but bureaucrats, magistrates, tutors, and civil servants. And yet the bento box still travels with them. Perhaps even more so, now the battlefield has changed. The enemy is no longer a rival clan, but disorder, inefficiency, or disrespect. The warrior's sharpest tool is no longer his katana, it is his discipline. And one of the most intimate symbols of that discipline remains. The lunchbox, a samurai's new routine. Tea, reports, and bento. The rising sun now illuminates scrolls and account ledgers rather than armor racks. In castle towns across Japan, Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, samurai begin their mornings not with sword drills, but with paperwork. The day begins early. A cup of sencha or powdered matcha green tea, perhaps accompanied by a piece of dried persimmon or roasted barley. By mid-morning, the samurai arrives at the magistrate's office or castle bureau. He sits on a straw mat. His inkstone is ground, his brush poised. Rice tax records must be reviewed. A dispute over farmland boundaries must be settled. A merchant seeks permission for a new storehouse. And when the bell or sun tells him it is time, he reaches for his cloth-wrapped bento. His moment of calm begins. Simpler boxes, greater symbolism during these times of peace. The samurai's bento becomes even more austere. Lacquered boxes are still used, but more often than not, practicality takes precedence. A plain wooden container. Wrapped in indigo-dyed cotton cloth, the furoshiki serves. Well, these bento are smaller now. Thinner. Designed for a day at the desk, not a march to war. Inside, you'll still find rice, but perhaps mixed with barley or millet, not out of necessity, but out of health. White rice alone, though desirable, was known to cause beriberi, a disease stemming from a vitamin B1 deficiency. Mixed grains offered better nourishment and kept the body light and alert. The box may hold a single pickled plum, a few strands of seasoned kanbu seaweed, or a tiny tamagoyakia, rolled omelette, delicately sweet, made the night before. There is still discipline. In this simplicity, each bite is intentional. No waste. No excess. The bento of rank. A quiet marker of hierarchy, even in this peaceful time. The bento box tells a story of status. The samurai caste was not monolithic. At the top were the hatamoto, direct retainers of the shogun. Below them, regional samurai who served daimyo lords. Still below were ronin, masterless samurai, scraping together their living through teaching or mercenary work, and bento reflected this silent hierarchy. A high-ranking samurai might carry a three-tiered lacquerware box. The top held rice, the second-tier pickles and delicacies, perhaps a sliver of grilled eel or simmered lotus root, and the bottom, a sweet bean cake or chestnut rice ball for the afternoon. His furoshiki would be patterned, dyed with expensive indigo or safflower hues. A low-ranking samurai, by contrast, carried a single-tiered wooden box. Millet rice, one umeboshi, and perhaps a slice of dried tofu. His cloth wrap might be faded, or patched. Yet both men ate the same way, kneeling, composed with quiet reverence. Status shaped the form, but not the spirit. Not the spirit. Samurai children and their first bento, even young samurai, were introduced early to the rituals of bento. In domain schools, hanko, where sons of the warrior class were educated, lunchtime was more than a break, it was a lesson. Children brought small bento boxes, often prepared by their mothers. These were not indulgent meals. They trained the child in portion control, seasonality, and stoicism. If the child complained of hunger, the answer was not more food. It was a reminder that restraint was part of Bushido, the warrior's path. If the bento was cold or plain, that too was part of training. Life would not always be warm or flavorful. Some schools even inspected lunches, not to shame, but to maintain equality. No student should eat extravagantly. All should eat modestly, and so the bento taught more than nutrition. It taught humility. The kitchen behind the box, samurai wives and servants. While samurai men carried the bento, they rarely prepared them. This task usually fell to their wives, mothers, or domestic staff. The women of samurai households bore immense responsibility, not only to manage food, but to maintain the entire household's honor. Food preparation was codified by class. There were guides, some even poetic, that dictated how much miso to add in winter versus summer, or how to cut lotus root so that it resembled clouds or coins. A wife who packed a poor bento risked more than embarrassment. It reflected poorly on her husband's image at court or in the office. A soggy pickle or cracked egg roll might be read as a crack in household discipline. Thus, in the early hours of dawn, while the samurai meditated or practiced brush strokes, the kitchen clattered with the quiet labor of women, shaping the day's nourishment. Bento and poetry. Lunch with a side of haiku. During this period, samurai were encouraged to engage in the arts, particularly poetry. It was not uncommon for bento breaks to include a haiku or two. Some samurai scribbled verses on rice paper, tucked beneath the bento lid. Others recited aloud as they unwrapped their meals, especially if they dined outdoors during inspections. Or long journeys. A popular pastime was to write haiku about the lunch itself. Not dramatic tales of war or loss, but poems about pickled plums, falling leaves, or the quiet sound of tofu hitting a wooden ox. A single plum rests between rice and the silence, winter still within. These verses weren't just entertainment. They were practice in observation, patience, and subtlety, all vital traits for both warriors and administrators. Samurai on the road. Bento as companion travel, was a significant part of a samurai's life. Whether on official inspection tours, pilgrimage, or relocating between posts, the road was long and the inns uncertain. For these journeys, a different kind of bento emerged, the koshi bento, or waist bento. A small, tightly sealed box strapped to the waist or saddle, often cylindrical, designed to resist jostling. These bento were packed with foods that would not spoil: salted rice balls, dried squid, soy-marinated burdock, or thick slices of roasted sweet potato. Some even included small paper-wrapped tea, leaves, and charcoal tablets to boil water on the road. The bento kept the traveler grounded, literally and spiritually. Each meal, even eaten roadside, was a reminder of home, of station, of ritual. And for some, it may have been the only warm moment on a cold, unfamiliar road. The decline of the samurai class and the bento's quiet survival by the late Edo period, pressures mounted. The arrival of foreign ships in the 1850s began to unravel the tight cultural order of Tokugawa Japan. The Meiji Restoration loomed. Swords were soon to be banned, samurai stipends revoked, and westernization embraced. But even as the class faded, the bento box endured. Former samurai, now teachers or low-level clerks, still carried their old boxes. Their blades may have been melted, their ranks dissolved, but the lunch ritual remained. In fact, the samurai bento became the prototype for modern Japanese lunch culture. The emphasis on balance, color, and seasonality lives on today in schoolchildren's kiraben, company worker ekeben, and even convenience store offerings. Yet few remember where it began, in the quiet dignity of a warrior's meal, taken without armor, without rush, and always with respect. Section 3. The last box, final. Meals of the dying samurai classic. Is the winter of 1877. The frost clings stubbornly to the trees of Kagoshima. In the southern reaches of Kyushu, the sound of rifles has replaced the ancient ring of the katana. The government of the newly modernizing Meiji Japan has turned its army uniformed, conscripted, trained by foreign officers, against the last holdouts of the old way, the samurai of Satsuma. Among them is Saigo Takamori, the so-called last true samurai. He stands at the heart of the Satsuma Rebellion, a tragic and desperate effort to preserve the dignity of a class that has been legally, socially, and economically erased. And still, as the rifles are cleaned and the cannons moved into place, someone prepares the bento, the final campaign. Food under fire. The Satsuma Rebellion was not merely the last gasp of an old warrior class, it was a logistical disaster. Cut off from major supply routes, the samurai rebels relied on what they could forage, carry, or have smuggled in. Gone were the delicate lacquered boxes and carefully cut omelets of the Edo era. Now, bento were wrapped in straw, folded in torn cloth, or carried in bamboo tubes slung over shoulders. They held cold rice, sometimes mixed with grass or chestnut paste to stretch limited rations. If pickles were present, they were homemade, crude, and few. There are records of samurai boiling bark or roots when food ran low. Others caught small river fish, roasting them over fire and packing leftovers in clay jars. One rebel's diary notes, "We each carry one day's worth rice, pressed in ash and salted plum. We eat in silence beneath smoke. The others say little. We are not hungry. We are remembering. In these final days, the bento box became something heavier than a meal. It was a reminder of the world they had lost. The Meiji soldiers' meal, iron. Rations and tin boxes on the other side of the battlefield stood the Meiji government's army. It was young, conscripted, and trained in Western tactics. Many of its soldiers had never worn a kimono of silk or carried a sword. They came from rice paddies and towns, recruited to serve the new nation dot, and their lunches were modern. Instead of wooden boxes wrapped in cloth, these soldiers received metal tins early military rations. Their meals included barley rice, dried meat or salted fish, pickled radish, and when possible, miso soup powder to be stirred into boiling water. Some units even received canned foods imported technology that shocked older samurai. Stewed, pork in metal cylinders, preserved fruits, and hard biscuits stored in wax paper. Efficient, flavorless, durable. The bento of the new soldier was utilitarian, standardized, anonymous. It mirrored the army itself, an institution no longer tied to class or clan. The contrast between these lunches was as symbolic as it was nutritional. The quiet, handcrafted tradition of the samurai bento versus the efficient, industrial food of a modernizing empire. The quiet before death. Saigo Takamori's final meal, the final stand, came at Shiroyama. It was here, in the shadow of a misty hill, that Sajo and his men made their last encampment. There is no detailed record of his final meal, but accounts offer hints. Witnesses describe small clay pots of rice porridge being passed between men. Dried persimmons, preserved over the winter, were shared quietly. Someone had brought pickled eggplant, likely the last of it. A pot of tea brewed over a campfire. Seigo himself reportedly refused a full meal that morning. Instead, he drank a cup of tea and nibbled on a rice ball. He spoke to his companion softly, reflecting on poetry, on loss, and on Japan. It is tempting to dramatize this moment, to imagine. The tea steaming in the cold air, the rice grains sticking to his calloused fingers. But the truth is likely more mundane. He was tired, his feet swollen, his robes torn. The food, plain and unsalted. It was the simplicity, not the tragedy, that made it sacred. After the rebellion. What survived of the samurai table when the rebellion ended and the old warrior class was finally dismantled by law? Many of their habits disappeared. Swords were banned from public wear. Clan schools closed. Samurai stipends abolished, but the bento remained. Former samurai, now farmers, merchants, or teachers, still packed their lunches as they had before. The wooden box became a relic of discipline. Carrying one, even in the modern age, marked you as a man of old values, restraint, order, refinement. Some families passed down bento boxes as heirlooms, not for use, but for memory. Others repurposed them, planting herbs inside, storing sewing needles, or keeping letters. And in the growing cities of Meiji Japan, office workers adopted the style. Government clerks in Western suits still unwrapped a cloth-bound wooden box. The rice inside now might be mixed with curry or served with beef, a new twist on old forms. The samurai were gone, but their lunch lived on. From warrior to worker, bento and the rise of the salarimanas, the 20th century began. Japan's transformation into a modern industrial state accelerated. The image of the ideal man shifted from armored warrior to buttoned-up office worker, the salaryman. Yet in lunchrooms, on park benches, and in schoolyards, the bento remained. Mothers packed them each morning with the same quiet care as samurai wives had done centuries earlier. A box of white rice, a few slices of grilled fish, a folded omelette, and 3 green peas carefully centered. Train stations began selling ekiben, travel bento for long journeys. Factory cafeterias offered metal trays inspired by military rations. And convenience stores, by the 1980s, turned bento into a packaged industry plastic trays with machine-cut vegetables and vacuum-sealed miso packets. And yet, the principles remained unchanged. Balance. Simplicity. Seasonality. Respect for food. Quiet reflection while eating. The modern bento, found in Tokyo or New York today, owes its shape to a world long buried wrapped in cloth, carried in silence, and eaten with purpose. Bento in memory. A quiet symbol of cultural continuity today. Museums across Japan display centuries-old bento. Boxes crafted from cypress, inlaid with shell, or painted with clan crests. They are not flashy artifacts. They lack the grandeur of swords or scrolls, but they whisper. They speak of quiet lunches beneath trees, of tea sipped before battle, of rice balls eaten on long roads, of children learning discipline, one bite at a time. They are objects of pause, of stillness. To open a bento box even now is to tap into a rhythm older than railroads, older than factories, older even than gunpowder in Japan. It is a rhythm of care, of deliberate living. A final thought. What did the samurai carry into the future? When the last samurai bent over his bento in 1877, he could not have known that the wooden box in his lap would outlive his class, his rebellion, and his ideals. And yet it did, not through force or glory, but through quiet usefulness, through nourishment, through the humble truth that every person, no matter how powerful or lost, must pause to eat. That, perhaps, is the deepest legacy of the samurai. Not only the sword, but the spoon. So the next time you unwrap your lunch, whether packed in paper, plastic, or polished wood, consider this. What parts of your life, your ritual, your quiet habits, will echo centuries from now? Will your own version of the bento be remembered? Story 2. The Great Pepper Road. How the Yoruba traded flavor like gold. Section 1. Seeds of spice. The rise of Yoruba trade towns. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of pepper, not the sharp, metallic heat of black pepper from India, but the rich, earthy fire of Otorodo, the West African bird's eye chili. It's late morning in 17th century Yorubaland, a sprawling cultural region in what is now southwestern Nigeria. The sun is rising slowly, hazy with red dust, and the clamor of a growing trade town is already alive with the day's purpose. Are standing in a marketplace. But this is no casual village square. This is a hub in a dense web of inland and coastal trade, an artery in what was quietly becoming one of the most sophisticated, complex, and underappreciated trade systems. In pre-colonial Africa. And in your hand, a woven pouch, warm and aromatic, filled with chili peppers so valuable they might be traded for cloth, livestock, or even weapons. This is the Great Pepper Road, an untold network of roads, porters, and negotiation tables across Yorubaland, where flavor became currency, and where the smallest seed could travel hundreds of miles in a pouch, in a calabash, or hidden in a merchant's robe. Let's walk through it together. What is Yorubaland? A landscape of kingdoms and markets. To understand the pepper trade, we must first understand the land that grew it. Yorubaland in the 1600s was not a single kingdom, but a mosaic of city-states and principalities. The Ayo Empire dominated the savannah. To the north, famous for its cavalry and bureaucracy. Southward, kingdoms like Ife, Ajibu, and Ondo thrived in rainforest zones. These city-states were politically autonomous, but economically interwoven. The geography itself lent to trade. Forests rich with hardwood, rivers that fed fertile fields, and footpaths that wound like threads through hills and valleys. Though the European presence was beginning to creep along the coasts, the heart of commerce remained internal African traders, merchants, farmers, and elite households moving goods by foot, canoe, and cart docked in this economy, Aitarodo and its relatives, like Bawa and Tatash, were more than condiments. They were symbols of status, preservatives, even medicine. And so, pepper became precious. The origin of heat. Where did the peppers come from? Here lies one of history's lesser-known stories. The chili pepper is not native to Africa. It came from the Americas, likely introduced to West Africa by Portuguese or Spanish traders in the late 15th or early 16th century, just after the Columbian Exchange began. Unlike other crops that struggled to adapt, chili peppers thrived. Their resistance to pests, fast growth cycle, and compatibility with local cuisines made them an instant favorite. But the Yoruba did not simply adopt peppers. They transformed them. Within a century, pepper cultivation had spread across farming settlements in the Oyo and Ikiti regions. Women, especially, cultivated them in small plots behind homes, alongside other staples like okra, garden eggs, and bitter leaf. Soon, peppers were not just used for stews or soups. They were dried, ground, smoked, and fermented. Pepper paste became a household product. Whole families, sometimes entire lineages, became known for the potency of their pepper blends, and with the surplus came opportunity. Market. Towns, where pepper became power. Now step into a Yoruba market town, say Ogbomosho or Erua, two towns that emerged as key inland trading posts. In the morning, traders arrived bearing bundles tied in Aso oak cloth. Women with shaved heads and heavy bangles bartered loudly under reed awnings. Men, sometimes acting as agents for noble houses, exchanged calabashes filled with crushed chili for bundles of dyed cloth, palm oil, dried fish, or tobacco. Pepper wasn't just bought and sold. It was categorized, prized. There were systems of grading for color, dryness, and heat. Some varieties were stored for royal kitchens. Others were used in religious rituals or ground into healing salves. Markets operated weekly, some rotating across towns in a circuit, allowing traders to move in patterns across the region. And always, the pepper went with them, strapped to donkeys, balanced in head baskets, packed into canoe holds. These were not small-time exchanges. In peak season, a large sack of dried pepper could fetch the same value as a goat. Pepper and power. The role of Yoruba women in the trade. One of the most overlooked aspects of this trade was who controlled it. Unlike many other parts of the world at the time, women were central, often dominant in Yoruba markets. Known as Iyaloyas, these women were not merely vendors, but powerful market leaders. They organized prices, managed disputes, and even represented market interests to local kings and chiefs. Some of the most successful pepper traders were women. They owned storage huts, managed transport caravans, and negotiated with long-distance traders who passed through on their way to Hausaland in the north or Benin in the east. Pepper, in many ways, was the currency of Métis in family compounds. Women who controlled pepper stores also controlled influence. They decided who ate what, who got medicine, who received blessings from the family shrine. Their pepper jars, sealed with wax or plant resin, became both vault and weapon. The pepper guilds and the first roads. As the pepper trade expanded, informal guilds and cartels began to form. Not in the Western corporate sense, but in tightly bound community groups, often tied by blood or marriage. In some towns, all pepper sold in the market had to be vetted by a specific group. These women and men set prices, ensured quality, and resolved conflicts. They also controlled the labor behind the scenes, porters who carried goods from farms, packers who filled sacks, and guards who protected shipments. The roads used by these merchants were not paved or marked on any European map. They were footpaths, sometimes traced over generations, cut through forest, valley, and savanna. The term Great Pepper Road is not a local one, but it captures the essence of what existed: a non-linear, decentralized, but incredibly efficient network of trade. No coins, no banks, just trust, reputation, and product. Pepper, as gift, medicine, and ritual. The value of pepper extended beyond commerce. In Yoruba spiritual practice, pepper was sacred. It was used in Ifa divination rituals, sometimes chewed before consultations, to sharpen the tongue, or burned in small bowls to clear spirits. In healing ceremonies, it was mashed and mixed with palm oil or cow bile to create medicinal balms. Pepper was also a gift. When visiting elders, newlyweds, or in-laws, bringing pepper was a sign of generosity. A small pouch of ground chili, wrapped in palm leaf and tied with twine, might carry more weight than silver. And in death, too, pepper remained. Some burial rites involved placing peppers near the deceased as a way to ward off evil spirits or symbolize the fire of the soul. So pepper in Yoruba life was never just food. It was presence. Coastal shifts. When foreigners found the fire by the late 1600s, the expanding reach of European traders along the coast began to change the flavor of the pepper trade. Portuguese, Dutch, and later British merchants who had originally sought gold and slaves began to take note of the inland commodities, like kola nuts, indigo, and yes, pepper. European logs from coastal trading posts describe red powder used for cooking, being traded in modest but growing quantities. Some enterprising Yoruba merchants began exchanging peppers for metal tools, coral beads, or even gunpowder. Others sold to middlemen who ferried goods to coastal ports like Lagos, Badagry, or Porto Novo. But even as trade expanded externally, the internal economy remained robust. Pepper was still more often carried by a girl with a head basket walking to her mother's stall than by a ship crossing the Atlantic. And that, perhaps, was its power. It moved with people. Section 2. Colonial Currents. Pepper in the Age of Empire. The world was changing. By the mid-19th century, the footpaths of Yorubaland, once trodden by barefoot porters and clay jug-carrying women, were beginning to yield to broader roads, mapped in European-led surveys. Rivers were being charted, towns renamed, and trade increasingly framed not in terms of barter, but currency. The British had tightened their grip on Lagos by 1861, declaring it a colony. Missionaries, merchants, and soldiers followed. Rail lines would soon scar the land, and custom stations would appear like gates to another world. But amid this sweeping transformation, the humble chili pepper still clung to its central role in Yoruba life. It had changed hands in courtyards and open markets. It had been offered in prayers, used to heal the sick, and traded for cloth and goats. But now, for the first time, it was being labeled, categorized, priced, and taxed. The Great Pepper Road was being paved over, but it wasn't gone yet. Pepper, in a world of tariffs and ledgers, in colonial eyes, not all crops were equal. Palm oil, cocoa, and later cotton became favored commodities for export. These were easily quantified, stored, and shipped. Pepper, on the other hand, was not yet on the radar of colonial planners. Its trade was too localized, too small-scale, too spicy, perhaps, for imperial tastes. But that also gave pepper some room to breathe. While the British colonial economy was busy regulating major exports, the pepper trade quietly continued, adapted, fragmented, but never truly broken. It slipped between the ledgers and around the customs houses. Women still packed it in calabashes, hid it in baskets beneath cassava leaves, or sewed it into cloth bundles bound for inland markets. There were new obstacles now: tolls on roads, fees for market stalls, inspectors with foreign badges asking to weigh and record what had never before been written down. But pepper, ever adaptable, found new routes. And Yoruba traders, especially women, found new ways to thrive. The rise of cash cropping, a fork in the road colonial. Administrators began pushing what they called cash crops, plants grown specifically for sale rather than subsistence. Cocoa, especially, took hold in parts of Yorubaland with the introduction of new seedlings and market incentives. Many Yoruba families planted cocoa groves. The crop was profitable, and European buyers eagerly purchased it for processing into chocolate. Abroad, but this shift meant something subtle. Fields once used for diverse local crops, including pepper, were now dedicated to monoculture as cocoa income rose. The practice of growing peppers in home gardens or fallow fields began to decline in wealthier households. Peppers became a thing to buy in the market, not grow at home. And where they had once been currency traded directly for oil, beans, or cloth, they were increasingly converted into coin. This monetization changed the dynamic. Traders who once negotiated based on tradition and reputation now had to contend with prices set by outsiders and taxes imposed from above. Still, the spice held on. Because no matter how valuable cocoa became, you could not make a din Yoruba pepper stew without peppers. Urban markets and market women. Resistance through routine. With growing urbanization came the rise of new, permanent marketplaces like Oya Oba in Ibadan, Oyingbo in Lagos, and Ida Osun in Ilesa. These were not mere stalls on village dirt paths. They were formalized, regulated spaces sometimes covered with tin roofs or surrounded by wooden fencing. Market authorities, often appointed by colonial or local governments, oversaw trade, but even here, in this new framework, pepper remained in the hands of Yoruba women. Iyaloyas, the matriarchs of the market, adapted to changing times. They learned to work with local chiefs and later colonial officers to secure rights, control stall space, and regulate prices. Some market women even paid bribes or offered gifts, woven mats, dried fish, jars of pepper paste to maintain their standing. These women, often dismissed by colonial administrators as uneducated, were in fact running sophisticated, multi-layered supply chains managing procurement, storage, marketing, and negotiation. Pepper was their leverage. It was still one of the most in-demand products, bought by every class, used daily, and impossible to substitute. And in that quiet persistence, they resisted cultural erasure. Through food, through flavor, through routine. New dishes, new customers. Pepper and cultural fusion. The colonial presence brought new people into Yoruba towns. Europeans, returnee ex-slaves from Brazil and Sierra Leone, Hausa and Igbo laborers, and later South Asian clerks. And as populations mixed, so too did their palates. Pepper was introduced to dishes like jollof rice, which traveled west from Senegal, and to Indian-style curries made with local meats. Brazilian-influenced dishes like moqueca, a seafood stew with peppers and palm oil, entered the Yoruba culinary space, often modified with local chili varieties. Pepper became a meeting point, a shared ingredient in a sea of change. And with it, Yoruba women found new markets. They began selling pepper blends, powdered, ground, mixed with salt or crayfish in small waxed packets. These could be sold to unfamiliar cooks, foreigners, or new arrivals in growing cities. A woman could now sell 10 packets in an hour, each one containing the labor of her garden and her grinding stone. In a world of changing currency, the heat remained consistent. Pepper. In protest, the 1929 Women's War, one of the most traumatic, though often undertold, stories of resistance in colonial West Africa was the 1929 Women's War, sometimes called the Aba riots. Though it began in southeastern Nigeria, among the Igbo, its influence rippled across Yoruba lands as well. Women rose up against unfair taxation, market controls, and colonial intrusion into their traditional economic roles. In some Yoruba towns, women boycotted markets, refused to pay trading fees, and marched in protest singing songs and brandishing the very tools of their trade, baskets, pestles, and bags of pepper. Pepper here was not only product, it was symbol. Its sting was protest. Its trade, an act of self-determination. Colonial records show administrators confused, even alarmed, by the coordination and influence of these women. But for the traders of Yorubaland, it was simple. You do not interfere with what feeds the people, and pepper was, and still is, what fed the people. Preservation and innovation. Pepper in the home, despite the shifting world outside. The Yoruba kitchen remained a place of remarkable continuity. Peppers continued to be dried on raffia mats, in courtyards, or smoked over wood fires for a deeper flavor. Mothers passed down grinding techniques, how to crush without bruising the seeds, how to combine with iru, fermented locust bean, for stew, how to store in gourds sealed with shea butter. New tools emerged: tin grinders, mortar with metal rings. The essence stayed the same, even as kerosene stoves replaced charcoal fires, and enamel bowls replaced clay pots. The red-orange glow of blended pepper remained, the heart of the cooking space. It was this quiet constancy that preserved Yoruba identity, not in textbooks, not in government declarations, but in lunch. And so the legacy of the Great Pepper Road lived on in kitchens, not caravans. Section 3. From calabashes to cellophane, the modern life of Yoruba pepper. The year was 1960. Nigeria had declared independence. In the streets of Ibadan, Lagos, and Ijebu-Ode, flags waved. Children danced. Radio stations played Fuji and High Life. Hope was thick in the air, hope for autonomy, for a return to indigenous greatness. But beneath the new flags and national slogans, something else persisted quietly. A trail of red. Not blood, not paint. Pepper, the same bright spice that once rode in woven baskets through forested footpaths, still lingered in steaming pots in vendor stalls, still warmed stews at every mealtime, and still stitched generations together through the unchanging ritual of flavor. What had once been part of sacred ritual and subsistence economy was now navigating a modern, urban, globalized Nigeria. The Great Pepper Road didn't end, it simply changed lanes. Pepper in the post-colonial kitchen, between tradition and convenience. By the 1970s, a quiet revolution was happening in Nigerian homes. Plastic bags were replacing calabashes. Freezers, for those who could afford them, changed how food was stored. Knives and electric blenders began to replace stones and pestles. But the pepper didn't leave. It adapted. Fresh Scotch bonnet chilies, still called adorned, were now sold at roadside stalls in small polythene bags, knotted like balloons. Dried pepper, at a gun, was pulverized by mechanical grinders, then scooped into old milk tins, weighed by scale, and packed into tiny sachets for customers. Instead of harvesting it from their backyard, many city-dwelling Yoruba women now bought their pepper every few days at Oya Aba or Balagan market, haggling over quality and freshness. Still, the pepper found its way into the bubbling pots. The grind of modernization hadn't erased the culinary instinct. Rather, it rechanneled it into city markets, into budget recipes, into high-rise apartments with single electric stoves. The old knowledge remained useful, even urgent. Young brides in 1980s Lagos still called their mothers from payphones to ask, "Mommy, how many adorned do I grind with the iru for Sunday stew?" The rise of processed peppers, from women's hands to factory jars around the same time. Nigeria saw the rise of packaged food products. Multinationals and local entrepreneurs alike began producing canned tomato pepper pastes, seasoning cubes, and ready-made spice blends. By the 1990s, rows of gleaming jars filled with reddish sauce appeared on shelves marketed as pepper base or pepper mix. These promised convenience. No grinding, no chopping, no weeping eyes. Just pour and cook. For many, this was a welcome relief, especially for working mothers and young professionals who no longer had the time or space for traditional preparation. But this convenience also marked a shift in power. The pepper, once controlled almost exclusively by women in local economies, was now being commodified and sold by corporations. Factory workers, often male, often disconnected from the tradition, processed what had once been ritual. Some families resisted, preferring to keep their ancestral pepper blends. Others embraced the ease. Most lived somewhere in the middle, combining homemade grinds with store-bought pastes, adjusting with dried at a gun as needed. What was lost in this shift wasn't just flavor, it was also memory. The hand-eye knowledge of how much pepper to add, the way one could tell the heat by smell alone, was harder to pass down through plastic packaging. Still, pepper remained essential. Still, it burned its way into every meal. Pepper and the global Nigerian identity with the rise of Nigerian diaspora communities in the UK, US, Canada, and beyond. Yoruba pepper traveled far beyond the borders of West Africa. In Peckham, South London, and the Bronx, New York, African grocery stores sold bright red chili mixes, dried pods, and frozen adorned sealed in foil packs. Yoruba grandmothers in Houston taught their grandchildren to grind pepper in kitchen sinks, and local chefs experimented with blending West African pepper bases with soul food or Caribbean flavors. In these new cities, pepper became not just food but identity, a link to home, a memory in the mouth, and just like in the villages of Oyo or Osogbo a century ago, it became a quiet assertion. We are still here. Even in glass skyscrapers or fluorescent-lit grocery aisles, you could open a Tupperware and be transported to a village courtyard, to the shadow of a cocoa tree, to a grandmother humming over a charcoal stove. The Yoruba pepper, globalized yet grounded, became part of a new cultural diplomacy, exported through cuisine, held dear in diaspora, and shared with curious outsiders who blinked at the heat but returned for more. Pepper futures, the silent crisis of climate and seeds today. Beneath the surface of this spicy resilience, a quiet challenge is growing. Climate change, erratic rainfall, and soil degradation are threatening pepper yields. Across Nigeria, some traditional varieties of adorado and sambo, long chili, are disappearing. Imported hybrid seeds, designed for faster growth, don't always match the flavor profiles or hardiness of local varieties. Many farmers now struggle to grow enough for both local markets and export demands. Prices fluctuate wildly. And younger generations, drawn to city life, are less inclined to cultivate home gardens. The art of drying, fermenting, and blending pepper, once common knowledge, is becoming rarer outside older generations or specialized food entrepreneurs. NGOs and agricultural researchers are now trying to preserve heirloom pepper varieties, documenting traditional growing methods, and offering seed banks. But the future is uncertain. Will the Yoruba pepper remain part of everyday life? Or will it become a specialty product packaged in boutique jars, reserved for the nostalgic and the wealthy? Only time will tell. Closing reflections. The trail that burned, but fed. If you trace a single pod of adorned back through time, you walk a remarkable path. From forest trails in 18th century Yorubaland to colonial train stations, from the mortar bowls of market women to the plastic shelves of diaspora groceries, pepper has not just seasoned meals, it has seasoned history. It is the currency of the poor and the accent of the feast. It has survived tariffs, roads, floods, and factories. It has been resisted, regulated, revered, and it is still today the first thing a Yoruba cook reaches for when the palm oil warms. The great pepper road was never paved. It was trodden, simmered, dried, smoked, sipped, and sung. And in that road is the untold story of survival. How a culture fed itself not just with calories, but with care. So when you eat a spoonful of ada din din, or feel that familiar fire of Yoruba pepper stew, know that you're tasting more than spice. You're tasting a journey. You're tasting persistence. You're tasting a people. And yet, as climate, migration, and modernization continue to reshape the land, will the next generation walk the same pepper trail? Or will they forget how it even began? Story 3. The Cabinet of Bureaucracy. How paperwork took over Victorian Britain. Section 1. Piles of parchment. When offices were stacks and clerks were memory machines. As a Tuesday morning in 1846, you're standing inside a London government office, let's say the General Register Office or the Admiralty's Supply Department. The windows are fogged. The air is thick with the smell of dust, coal smoke, and ink. You hear the scratch of quill pens, the occasional cough, and the shifting feet of clerks in long wool coats. The noise is gentle, rhythmic like a hive that never truly hums. The men here are quiet, serious, and almost entirely surrounded by paper. Not books, not folders, just paper, stacks of loose parchment, bound with ribbons or held between sheets of old leather. Letters, ledgers, tax rolls, ship manifests, inventories of biscuits, census records, wills, warrants. All of it is paper, and there is no reliable way to store it. That was the problem. That was the boredom. That was the birth of something profoundly unremarkable. A box that would change the world of information. But before the cabinet, there was chaos. The British Empire's paper addiction. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire was an expanding machine built on documentation. Its arteries were ink, and its nerves were parchment. Everything needed to be written down. How much tea was arriving from SM, which officer was posted in Sierra Leone, how many paupers were in Manchester, what crime had been committed in Bristol. Industrial revolution had already sparked an explosion in communication. More railways meant more mail. More trade meant more contracts. And more cities meant more municipal paperwork. Governance became a function of documentation. No longer could a clerk simply remember what shipment left Plymouth last Thursday. There were now too many shipments, too many Thursdays, and too many ports. And so paper took over. But paper has a problem. It is both fragile and expansive. One report becomes a dozen pages. A dozen reports become a bound volume. And a year's worth of files become a mountain that topples with a single sneeze. At the time, most offices stored documents on open shelves, in stacked boxes, or behind lockable doors in bespoke furniture. The result? Inefficiency. To find a letter from 1832, a clerk might have to open 10 boxes, unroll scrolls, and ask a senior officer, who seemed to remember it being filed under miscellaneous naval affairs. Sometimes, files went missing for decades. Sometimes they never returned. It was, quite literally, paperwork madness. The clerk as living memory in this system. Information didn't live in furniture. It lived in people. Experienced clerks became repositories of institutional memory. They knew which ledger held the grain shipment for Liverpool in March 1840 because they had once written the entry themselves. They remembered who had handled the correspondence about a bridge collapse in Exeter. Because they recalled the unusual fold in the paper, these clerks were not celebrated. They were not well paid, but they were indispensable. They were, in a sense, living filing cabinets. A junior clerk's job was mostly to copy, sort, or deliver papers. But over the years, the best clerks gained reputations as finders people, who could locate a document by intuition, scent, or muscle memory. Still, even the best memories falter. And when a clerk retired or died, their memory of where documents had been stored often died with them. A. Missing file could cause weeks of delay or derail a court case or stall a shipment. It was not efficient. It was not sustainable. It was not modern. A desk full of drawers. Early efforts to contain the chaos. By the 1850s, furniture makers and office suppliers began experimenting with new types of storage. Enter the pigeonhole desk. These desks were massive, often custom-built, and had dozens of square compartments, just large enough to hold folded sheets of foolscap or ledger paper. Some were labeled alphabetically. Others were organized by department. Still others were entirely unlabeled, relying on each clerk's unique system. To a modern eye, these pigeonholes resembled a letterbox grid or the backroom of an old post office. But at the time, they were revolutionary. Instead of throwing files in a box or piling them on a windowsill, a clerk could now assign each category its own hole. C for contracts, M for maps, X for things best not discussed. It was a start, but it wasn't scalable. A pigeonhole system only worked if the office was small and if the clerk was diligent. It required daily upkeep, and it offered no protection from fire, dust, water, or most common of all, misfiling by another employee. There was no standard, no lock, no real security. Offices still burned down with thousands of uncatalogued papers inside. The filing cabinet appears. American imports and British hesitation would take an invention from across the Atlantic to begin to solve Britain's paper problem. In the 1890s, American office equipment companies began manufacturing vertical filing cabinets, tall metal boxes with drawers that could slide in and out, holding manila folders suspended on rails. Each folder could be labeled. Each document could lie flat. And best of all, cabinets could be locked. The American cabinet was modern, minimal, and designed to last. It didn't rely on memory. It relied on method. British offices initially resisted. Victorian sensibilities favored wooden furniture, elaborate designs, and trusted human habits over industrial uniformity. Metal cabinets were seen as cold, American, and unbecoming of a proper English office. But slowly, utility won. By the early 20th century, British civil service departments began to adopt the cabinet en masse. Drawers replaced pigeonholes. Folders replaced ribbons. Index systems replaced intuition. And so, a new regime of paper began, not lessen it, but more order within it. The filing cabinet didn't reduce bureaucracy. It formalized it. It didn't limit the state. It made its memory endless. The bureaucratization of everyday life. By the time the First World War erupted in 1914, nearly every government office in Britain used some form of filing cabinet. But so did banks, hospitals, insurance firms, and schools. Cabinet became a symbol not of efficiency, but of permanence. Anything worth keeping had to be filed. Anything not filed might as well not exist. This was the true shift. Where information once lived in people, it now lived in drawers. Where knowledge was once passed down, it was now filed away. Every birth, marriage, hospital visit, tax form, and military pension had a folder. And every folder had a number. And every number could be retrieved ideally without ever needing to ask someone named. Harold, who used to handle that back in '79. It was boring. It was invisible. But it worked. And yet, what was lost? In standardizing memory, did we lose something else? The older clerks, the ones who remembered by touch and smell, faded into history. The emotional connection to documents, the pride of remembering a difficult file, the shared stories behind a case were gradually erased. Files no longer had personal fingerprints. They had tabs, numbers, codes. Was it better? Undoubtedly. 4. Efficiency. But was it richer? More human? That's a harder question. Still, the filing cabinet endured. And so too Did paper dot the empire's drawers? How filing shaped law, war, and ordinary lives. By the time Queen Victoria passed in 1901, her government had already become a giant archive. From Ireland to India, from British Honduras to Burma, the filing cabinet wasn't just a piece of office furniture. It had become the skeleton of administration. Every letter from a colonial official, every census sheet, tax register, and consular dispatch eventually found its way into one. The filing cabinet was not just for clerks. It was for control. And with it came a new kind of power. The power of knowing where things were years later. The power of retrieving a birth certificate issued 3,000 miles away. The power of showing in cold, tidy ink that a debt had been paid or had not. The filing cabinet brought the promise of order to a world previously run on memory, mess, and the silent chaos of loose-leaf paper. But like all tools of empire, its impact was not evenly felt. It helped some, it surveilled others, and sometimes it simply buried truths too deep in the drawer to be found again. The cabinet in the courts. Order becomes law. Take the case of a small British court in 1907, where a land dispute arose over a parcel of farmland outside Cambridge. The family claiming the land insisted they had held the title since the 1830s, but the other party presented a typed, filed copy of a sale dated 1879, complete with stamp, notary seal, and most importantly, its filing code. The original owners. Heirs brought forth an old, crumbling handwritten note, a deed of sorts, passed through generations and held in a leather pouch. But the court ruled against them. The paper in the filing cabinet was deemed more legitimate. It was retrievable, indexed. It lived in a system, not in a family drawer. In effect, filing created authority. Documents weren't necessarily more true, but they were more organized. And in the emerging bureaucratic age, organization became synonymous with legitimacy. Once a record was properly filed, it became something else. It wasn't just a note, it was history. Not a memory, it was evidence. The war years, cabinets. In the trenches, during the First World War, filing cabinets found their way to the front. Not literally, of course. But the British War Office and its newly formed Ministry of Munitions depended on clerical accuracy to an astonishing degree. Who was wounded where? Which regiments needed ammunition? How many horses were requisitioned in Suffolk? Which families back home required a death notice? It's difficult to overstate how much the war relied on clerks, mostly men at the start, but increasingly women as the war dragged on, to keep track of millions of moving parts. Each soldier had a file. Every requisition form had a copy. Hospitals sent reports. Field offices telegraphed data. The cabinet back home held it all. And when things went wrong, when rations didn't arrive, or a soldier was declared dead who turned out to be alive, often the problem could be traced back not to bad intent, but to misfiling. Wrong drawer, wrong name, wrong cabinet. In the fog of war, even bureaucracy becomes a kind of survival. You don't eat without a requisition slip. You don't get home without a signed release. You don't get remembered without a burial file. The expansion of the filing mindset, hospitals, schools, and the home after the war. The cabinet followed soldiers home. In civilian life, it invaded other spaces. The National Health Insurance Act of 1911 had already introduced medical records for working men, but by the 1920s and 30s, local clinics, hospitals, and even midwives kept patient files. Schools began keeping attendance registers, test scores, and behavioral records filed and stored by grade, year, and student name. Charities adopted cabinets to track aid recipients. Banks used them to calculate mortgages. Even churches replaced many of their old handwritten ledgers with typed forms stored in fireproof drawers. Gradually, the public began to internalize the cabinet mindset. If it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. If it isn't filed, it isn't. Real dot, it was the slow triumph of paper over memory. Filing becomes feminized. Women take over the drawers. A quiet revolution happened inside these cabinets. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the number of women employed in clerical roles exploded. At first, they were typewriters, a term used both for the women and the machines. But soon, they became record keepers, archivists, and filing clerks. Their work was seen as menial but essential, precise, repetitive, and detailed. Entire departments were staffed by women filing birth records, pension forms, welfare claims, and insurance documents. They wore stiff blouses, kept their hair pinned, and labored in rooms full of drawers. And in this feminized filing world, some surprising things happened. Errors dropped, systems improved. New filing methods, such as color-coded folders and decimal classification, emerged from women-led filing offices. Despite their lack of authority or pay parity, these women had a profound impact on the logic of the modern record. Their precision became the backbone of trust in paper-based systems. They didn't often write history, but they organized it. A new kind of forgetting, but with all this order, something paradoxical began to occur. The better we filed things, the more we forgot we had them, because when memory was internal, when Harold the clerk remembered the 1840 shipping list, it was actively used. But once documents were filed and drawers locked, they often faded from active knowledge. Sometimes that was harmless. Other times it was disastrous. Entire generations of colonial reports sat unread in basement archives. Critical infrastructure plans for railways or water systems were filed, forgotten, and then unknowingly duplicated decades later. And in cases of scandal, wrongful imprisonment, denied pensions, war crimes officials often claimed, "We couldn't find the file." Sometimes that was true. Sometimes it was convenient. A missing document wasn't just a logistical error, it was a shield. The very system designed to preserve knowledge also made it easier to lose. Cabinet as symbol control, not access over time. The filing cabinet became more than a tool. It became a metaphor for bureaucracy itself. To be filed away was to be ignored. To dig into the files was to uncover a hidden truth. To lose it in the filing cabinet meant burying something under processed in popular cartoons. Stern officials sat behind rows of drawers, stamping papers, never looking up. In novels, the civil servant who checked the files was often the one avoiding action. The cabinet was not always seen as helpful. Sometimes it was an obstacle. It did not speak. It did not explain. It simply existed, cold, quiet, and full of secrets. The drawer that defined a century in the end. The filing cabinet became one of the defining technologies of the 20th century, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it standardized how we think about knowledge. It taught people to sort, index, label, and retrieve. It reinforced the idea that truth should be stored, not remembered. And while it never inspired awe, it underpinned nearly every legal, medical, educational, and governmental system in the industrial world. It was dull. It was ordinary. It was quietly revolutionary. But even then, one question lingered beneath the drawers, waiting for someone to ask. What happens when we trust the cabinet more than the person? Section 3. The Paper Empire's Last Breath. From Cabinets to Clouds by. The mid-20th century, the clatter of typewriters echoed through government halls and business offices alike. Metal filing cabinets stood like quiet sentinels lined up, bolted down, stuffed full of folders with names, numbers, and notations. At its peak, the paper empire was overwhelming. In 1965, the UK's civil service stored more than 300 million individual paper records. Offices were built not just for people, but for cabinets. And yet, this was the beginning of the end, at the very success of filing its density. Its growth, its sheer volume had made it unsustainable. By the 1970s, government archivists were quietly panicking. Shelves were full. Files were misfiled. Papers yellowed. Staples rusted. And there were whispers, in tech circles and bureaucratic backrooms, of something new. A machine that didn't. Need drawers. A machine that could remember better than Harold the clerk, faster than Edith the typist. A computer dot from drawers to disks. The digital filing revolution, the transition wasn't instant. Bureaucracies rarely move quickly, and early. Computers were temperamental. But bit by bit, paper gave way to pixels. The first records digitized were simple. Names, dates, insurance codes, payroll information. In the 1980s, British hospitals began scanning patient records. Tax forms were entered into mainframes. Libraries, those old masters of cataloging, started digitizing. Card indexes. But the real shift wasn't just in where data lived. It was in how people thought about memory. Before. Memory was tactile. You could touch the folder. Smell the ink. Hear the scrape of the drawer. Bureaucratic memory was an action. You filed it. You retrieved it. Now memory became invisible. It existed in blinking lights and magnetic pulses. A keystroke could find a document faster than hours of digging. Clerks who once spent their lives opening drawers now typed quietly at monitors. Filing wasn't just faster, it was abstract. And with that abstraction came new tensions. The quiet. Death of the clerk. The filing cabinet had created a certain kind of job. Careful, repetitive, orderly. For generations, clerks had been society's organizers. The invisible class keeping everything on track. They knew the systems. They respected the processes. They didn't make decisions, but they ensured those decisions had paper to stand on. With digital storage came automation. By the 1990s, a clerk might find their entire day's work handled by a database query. No more sorting forms. No more physical registers. No more smell of carbon paper or rubber stamps. For some, it was a relief. No more paper cuts. No more backaches from hauling boxes of files. But for others, it was a loss of purpose. Entire departments shrank or vanished. Filing rooms were repurposed. File clerks became data entry operators, and eventually, many were replaced altogether. The cabinet, once so powerful, was now seen as clutter. Where does the paper go? The problem of legacy archives. But paper doesn't disappear just because we stop using it. By 2000, the UK National Archives housed over 180 kilometers of paper shelving, most of it in climate-controlled basements. Local councils still had files from the 1800s. Schools retained decades of attendance records. Police stations kept old case files that no one had opened in years. Some were valuable. Many were not. But no one quite knew which was which. Sorting. It would cost millions. Destroying it felt dangerous. So the paper stayed. Dusty, boxed, rarely consulted, but still, in theory, part of the living bureaucracy. And so, the old and the new lived side by side. A clerk might input data into a sleek software platform in the morning, and by afternoon be down in the basement, flipping through pension folders from the 1950s to resolve a dispute. Clouds and control. The new bureaucratic anxiety as the 2010s dawned. The cabinet's modern successor appeared not a machine in a room, but a server in the sky. Cloud computing allowed governments and corporations to store unimaginable amounts of data off-site. No more drawers, no more keys, no more limit. But with that came a new question. Who controls the cloud? Whereas physical cabinets were often in the same building as the officials who used them, cloud servers might be on another continent, managed by third-party companies, protected by encryption, yes, but also subject to crashes, hacks, or deletion. What had once been physical power knowing What drawer the file was in had become a matter of access rights, passwords, and cybersecurity. Protocols. And for all its speed, the cloud introduced a strange new fragility. A file can survive in a dusty drawer for 100 years. Corrupted server might wipe out 1,000 folders in seconds. The cabinet lives on, in spirit, despite everything. The logic of the filing cabinet survives. You can see it in your computer desktop with its virtual folders, in your phone's Notes app, where you file things by topic, in your email inbox, which can be sorted, tagged, archived, retrieved. Even the language remains. We still speak of pulling a file, filing taxes, or filing a complaint. When something vanishes, we say it was lost in the files. The cabinet, it turns out, was not just a piece of furniture. It was a way of thinking. From control to transparency, a change in bureaucratic philosophy. One of the unexpected outcomes of the cabinet era was opacity. Paper files stored in physical rooms were often difficult to access. If you didn't know a file existed or which cabinet it was in, you couldn't get it. Governments learned to hide things simply by misfiling them. Digital systems, paradoxically, have made some bureaucracies more open. Freedom of information, FOI laws, digital search tools, and public records databases allow citizens to see what's been written about them or about their government. Suddenly, the filing cabinet's power flipped. Instead of hiding, it revealed. Instead of silence, it exposed. But that exposure, too, comes with risk. Misunderstood documents can cause panic. Incomplete records can mislead. Bureaucratic writing, never known for its clarity, can spark conspiracies when read out of context. In the cabinet era, secrets faded in dusty drawers. In the cloud era, they go viral in hours. The legacy of boredom. It's easy to dismiss all of this as dull. Filing? Paper? Bureaucracy? But in truth, the filing cabinet shaped more of your world than you realize. It decided who got a pension, who inherited land, whose arrest record followed them, whose war service was remembered, whose name was spelled correctly, or not at all. It organized education, taxation, identification, medical care, and history itself. The cabinet didn't make history exciting. It made it work. And while it never featured in great battles or stirring speeches, it quietly ensured that the results of those battles and the words of those speeches were preserved. The final drawers. Oh, what do we do now? Now that the cabinets are rusting away in old municipal offices. Now that the keys are missing and the clerks retired and the paper is brittle and fading, we could throw them out, scan what we need, move on. But maybe, just maybe, we should keep one cabinet. One drawer, filled not with declarations or revolutions, but with the ordinary forms that once held a world together. A birth certificate from 1883, a school record from 1912, a complaint letter about postmen from 1937, a grocery, permit from the rationing years, a pension form with smudged ink. To remind ourselves that the great arc of civilization was also written in carbon copy, that every empire, in the end, is filed somewhere. And maybe, on a quiet afternoon, a century from now, someone will open that drawer and find the past, not glamorous, not bold, but deeply, unforgettably human. Story 4. Socks, Straw, and Survival. The Daily Chores of Roman Soldiers. Section 1. Sandals on the Danube. Life at the edge of the Roman Empire. You might picture a Roman soldier standing proud in gleaming armor, red tunic crisp, sandals strapped. With military precision, perhaps gazing heroically toward some enemy frontier. That image is mostly borrowed from Hollywood, glossed with triumph and terror. But most days, that same Roman soldier was simply bored and busy, sweeping the fort, fixing sandals, digging a ditch, checking socks for lice, making sure the pickled fish hadn't gone bad, endlessly scrubbing pots, repairing roofs, maintaining weaponry, logging firewood, and writing letters home if he could write at all. At the edge of the Roman Empire, places like Vindolanda in northern Britain or Dacia along the Danube, soldiers lived in quiet repetition. And it's in those places that the most mundane, human aspects of ancient military life survived. Forget the battles. Let's look at what really kept the legions running. Chores. The fort as a machine of maintenance. The Roman fort wasn't a battlefield. It was a functioning, breathing machine. And like any machine, it needed constant attention. Fortresses such as Vindolanda, built around 85 CE, in modern-day Northumberland, or Castra Regina in Germania, were home to hundreds of men, horses, slaves, officers, and sometimes families. Their layout followed strict patterns: barracks, command centers, granaries, latrines, and tool sheds. Everything had a place. Every surface needed sweeping. Every wooden beam required oiling or inspection for rot. Leather straps dried and cracked in cold climates and had to be softened and reworked. Clay tiles on rooftops needed rearranging after storms. Soldiers didn't just train for war. They cleaned it, maintained it, repaired it, prepared for it endlessly without a single battle in sight. If a tile broke, someone wrote it down. If a sandal wore out, it was replaced. If firewood stocks fell below a certain level, a record was made. This obsessive recording of the small stuff wasn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It was survival. In some cases, entire days were lost to just one chore: refitting shields, sewing tents, or refilling water stores. Sock weather. Roman soldiers in cold climates. You might think of Romans as warm climate people. Sandals, togas, and sun. But when legions were stationed in Britain or the Germanic frontiers, the weather demanded adaptation. Archaeologists at Vindolanda discovered a handwritten note that casually requested more socks. Socks, woolen ones specifically, hand-knit or woven from scratch, and probably layered under sandals. Despite the fashion clash, sandals alone didn't suffice on the frost-bitten hills of Britannia. Soldiers made do by wrapping their feet in fabric or leather, sometimes layering them with straw insulation. Makeshift cloaks were woven from undyed wool, gray and itchy, but functional. Some soldiers even sewed fur into their tunics. This was not officially issued. Many editions were local improvisations. Roman supply lines didn't always deliver on time. When they didn't, soldiers got creative. They bartered with locals. They bought extra warmth with their modest pay. They shared tricks: how to stuff moss into boots or how to dry out soaked wool over a smokeless fire. Fashion mattered less than frostbite. The toilet situation, latrines, hygiene, and sponge sticks. Life in a Roman fort wasn't just about military readiness. It was about logistics. And few logistics were more daily than waste. Roman latrines were marvels of practicality. Shared and often stone-built, they had long bench seats with keyhole-shaped holes carved into them. Water channels ran below and in front of the seats. Used to carry waste away and to rinse the sponge on a stick, a communal item used in place of toilet paper. Yes, sponge sticks. Each soldier had access to one, rinsed in flowing water after use and often shared across men. That might sound shocking today, but to Roman sensibilities, it was just another tool like a kitchen ladle or broom. Cleanliness, after all, was central to Roman life. Not luxurious cleanliness, but functional. Soap was rare, but oil and scraping tools were used for bathing. Soldiers removed dirt by applying olive oil and scraping it off with a curved blade called a strigil. Public baths, sometimes within the fort, allowed soldiers to sweat, scrub, and soak, although more often than not, they just stood in cold water for 5 minutes before heading back to duty. Feeding the fort, rations, lentils, And boring bread feeding a few hundred soldiers was no small task. Every fort had its grain stores. Each man received a ration, usually wheat or barley, along with a rotating supply of lentils, vinegar, wine, heavily watered down, dried figs, olives, and saltfish. Most of the food was boring. Hardtack bread, known as bushaladam, was nearly inedible without soaking. It was dry enough to survive weeks in transport. Lentils and beans were boiled into bland mush. Sometimes pork was salted and stored in ceramic jars. Vegetables, when they appeared, were local cabbage, onions. Garlic dot soldiers were expected to cook for themselves or share duties in small teams. Fort kitchens, such as those found in Vindalanda, were compact spaces with clay ovens and grinding stones. Burnt grain found in archaeological layers tells us soldiers were frequently distracted enough to scorch their food. One letter from a centurion at the edge of the empire casually mentions receiving some rather sour wine, unfit for drinking but still better than the water. Even bad wine, it seems, had value. The unexpected power of the writing tablet among the greatest treasures unearthed from Roman forts like Vindalanda were writing tablets thin, wooden pieces coated in wax or ink used for daily communication. These weren't grand declarations. They were shopping lists, schedules, requests. One of the most touching artifacts ever found was a birthday invitation from one Roman woman to another. But more often, the notes were utilitarian. Send more nails for boot repair. The cohort is short of horseshoes. A man has been injured awaiting further instruction. These tablets survived by accident, preserved in anaerobic mud. But they reveal something incredible, a bureaucracy of boredom. A day-by-day record of chores and needs, captured in handwriting that was sometimes elegant, sometimes hurried, sometimes barely legible. The written word helped the Roman army stretch thousands of miles across Europe and hold together. Orders moved via courier, records were copied, inventories logged dot, and at the heart of it were scribes and centurions, people whose full-time job was to write everything down. Disciplined through repetition, if a Roman soldier overslept, skipped a chore, or got sloppy with cleaning his armor, the punishment wasn't often dramatic dot. It was simply more work. Offenders were ordered to carry heavier loads, dig deeper ditches, or stand night guard in foul weather. A soldier who left his boots dirty might be made to scrub the barracks floor. Again and again. Why? Because repetition built discipline. Marching wasn't just for show. It was exercise, rhythm, teamwork. Chores weren't just about cleanliness. They were about routine, obedience, and pride. Some soldiers came to value the order. Many had grown up in poverty or chaos. Life in the legions while harsh offered structure. Meals, duties, purpose. A bed, companionship and for a few, even a pension the forgotten value of boring things. We often ask why Rome lasted so long. Was it the roads, the aqueducts, the laws? All true, but perhaps in the quieter corners of history, it was also this. Socks, soap, and scribes. Roman power wasn't just projected through conquest. It was maintained through chores, through daily routines, through the ordinary labor of keeping things clean, warm, dry, fed, and recorded. An empire, after all, is only as strong as its ability to function on a wet Tuesday in February. The edge of the Roman world. A soldier hangs his cloak by the hearth. He counts nails, stirs lentils, unlaces his worn sandals and rubs his feet. Outside, the wind howls across the Danube. Inside, a sponge on a stick waits by the latrine. Tomorrow, he'll do it all again. But tonight, he scratches a short message onto a tablet. Send more socks. Section 2. Fires, footwear, and fort walls. The tools of bored empire. The mighty Roman Empire wasn't built in a day, but it was maintained, quite literally, brick by brick and boot by boot. The everyday survival of the Roman army hinged on tools, materials, and the relentless diligence of its soldiers. This wasn't glorious work. This was fixing sandals with bronze tacks. This was checking walls for weather damage. This was cleaning out the fire pit in a shared cooking shelter with a spoon-shaped trowel, while cursing yesterday's overcooked lentils. Let's take a closer look at the tools and habits that filled those quiet, cold, damp days in the life of a soldier, one mundane task at a time. The shoemaker's corner. Colleague and cobbling a soldier's most important possession? His colleague's sturdy, hobnailed sandals. These weren't fashion items. They were marching gear, ventilation systems, and anti-slip devices all rolled into one. Designed to last hundreds of miles, the open-toe design allowed feet to breathe, but often exposed them to frost, rain, and thorns. To repair them, forts had designated cobbler's corners, small workshops filled with awls, needles, scraps of leather, and jars of pitch. Soldiers patched their own sandals when they could, but each fort had at least one man handy with leather. Tiny bronze nails, shaped like tacks, were hammered into the soles in specific patterns, not for aesthetics, but traction. They helped grip muddy roads, and when they wore out, replaced them again and again. When we uncover Roman forts today, we often find clusters of these hobnails, hundreds of them rusted into the dirt, as if a soldier had finally thrown out a sandal too far. Gone to save, one archaeologist described it as walking on thumbtacks for 20 miles at a stretch. Not comfortable, but functional. Tools of the fort: rushes, buckets, and brooms. If you'd stepped into a Roman barracks around 120 CE and opened a supply chest, you'd have found tools that look remarkably familiar. Brooms made of bundled twigs, used for sweeping dust and hay. Wooden buckets, sometimes reinforced with bronze bands for hauling water or cleaning. Shovels and pickaxes, forged from iron, used for digging latrines, clearing ditches, or building roads. Charcoal scoops for moving embers from one brazier to another. Even small cooking implements, tongs, ladles, and pottery mixing bowls played their role in the ecosystem of order. Everything was counted. Everything had a place. If you lost a broom, you'd have to explain it. It wasn't just military hierarchy that kept order. It was the threat of being assigned latrine duty with nothing but your bare hands and a bad attitude. Firewood and the eternal struggle with wet logs, no matter where they were stationed, from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Germania Roman. Soldiers needed fire, not just for warmth, but for cooking, boiling water, drying clothes, and scaring off the worst of the damp. Which meant one thing: firewood patrols. Soldiers often ventured out in pairs to gather logs from nearby forests or scrublands. They carried crude axes and bundled wood onto makeshift sleds or baskets, and it was never dry. British forts in particular had to deal with cold rain, heavy fog, and frozen earth. Lighting a fire with wet logs and damp kindling became an art form. Veterans passed down tricks: dry twigs stored inside tunics, or straw braided into fire starters. Some forts stored hay or brush under the barracks to stay dry. Others built small, elevated shelters just for keeping logs out of the rain. Fires weren't just comfort, they were survival. If you couldn't get a flame going, you didn't eat hot food. You didn't stay dry. And the centurion was not going. To be sympathetic. Patchwork and patching up uniforms in the Roman army were simple: tunics, cloaks, sandals, belts. But they wore down quickly. Mending clothes wasn't just encouraged. It was expected. Soldiers carried needle kit small cases, made of bone or bronze, filled with iron needles, thread, and patches. Tattered cloaks were reinforced at the shoulders. Torn tunics were patched with spare cloth. They weren't pretty repairs, but they worked. One of the surviving letters from Vindolanda mentions a request for a warmer cloak, if possible, as the current one is full of holes and of poor color. Clothing wasn't just for status. It was insulation. It was armor against boredom and the cold. And sometimes, a mark of pride soldiers often stitched their initials or unit symbols into their garments. There were no washing machines, of course. Laundry duty meant hauling clothes to a stream, soaking them in lye or vinegar, and beating them against rocks. A good laundry day ended with a relatively clean tunic and fingers raw from scrubbing. There's nothing to do. Boredom, as a battle one of the worst enemies of a Roman soldier wasn't a barbarian. It was boredom. Letters recovered from outposts, like Vindolanda, are laced with weariness. I send my greetings to you, and I ask again when the mail will arrive. There is little to do here but wait, waiting for food, for letters, for orders. Some soldiers turned to gambling, using carved bone dice and coins. Others wrote letters, cleaned their gear for the 100th time, or whittled wood into spoons and tokens. The most creative carved game boards directly into the stone floors of the barracks. Game pieces were often just pebbles or bone chips. Boredom wasn't just a feeling. It was a threat to discipline. Officers knew this. Keeping men busy wasn't just for cleanliness. It was psychological. It kept minds occupied, prevented complaints, kept fists from flying. The best antidote to boredom? More chores. A quiet kind of glory we so often measure history by explosions. Wars, fires, rebellions. But there's another kind of history. The quiet. The kind built by men fixing roof leaks. By soldiers patching cloaks. By scribes recording each jar of olive oil. By cooks boiling beans over smoky fires. Roman soldiers didn't just win battles. They kept the system running. One latrine cleaned, one sock patched, one bucket filled at a time. They likely didn't think of themselves as heroes. But centuries later, we remember them not for their swords, but for their sandals. Section 3. Letters, latrines, and the quiet. March toward history. The sun rises slowly over the edge of Hadrian's Wall. The morning air is thick with fog. A soldier groans and pulls a wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. Somewhere nearby, another soldier is shaking out a damp tunic, preparing for his shift at the north. WATCHTOWER. There is no battle today. There may not be one this month. But the garrison still stirs. Because while conquest builds an empire, routine maintains it. In this final section, we'll walk through a typical day in the life of a Roman soldier. Not the battles, not the glory, but the rhythm of life filled with letters home, latrine duty, and the steady heartbeat of a distant frontier. Post, wake-up call and morning muster. A Roman soldier's day started at sunrise. Not with blaring horns, but with the low call of the buccina. A curved trumpet used to signal the beginning of the day. Soldiers woke quickly. Time was carefully managed. Personal grooming came first. Faces were washed with cold water from wooden basins, and beards were scraped with bronze or iron razors, dull from overuse. Clothing was simple but specific. A linen or wool tunic. Leather belt, cingulum with bronze-fitting sandals. Caligae, repaired more often than not. Cloak, sagum, in colder climates. Fastened at the shoulder. Then came the morning inspection. Each sentry lined up in rows of 10, their armor checked by their centurion. Helmets were shined, weapons sharpened, and boots examined. And if your kit wasn't up to standard, you'd be assigned the next cleaning shift, or worse, have your rations docked. Food, porridge, pulse, and patience. Breakfast was plain. Usually a warm mush made from barley or wheat pulse, the Roman equivalent of oatmeal. Sometimes it had lentils or chickpeas mixed in. Sometimes nothing but a dash of vinegar and salt. Bread was common, especially hardtack, bucellatum, baked in large batches, meant to last weeks. These rock-hard loaves were soaked in wine or water before eating. Meat was rare, unless hunting was. Good. More often, the men ate dried beans, onions, garlic, and fermented fish sauce. Garum, a pungent staple of Roman cuisine that no one today would eat voluntarily. Cooking was done in shifts with shared iron pots and stone hearths. Each contubernium, a unit of 8 soldiers, took turns managing food and fuel. Eating wasn't leisurely. Meals were timed, silent unless orders were given. After all, duty always called. Latrines, hygiene, and health maintenance, yes, even in ancient Rome, soldiers had to clean toilets. Military forts had latrines, long wooden benches with keyhole-shaped holes, built over running water channels. A sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium, was used in place of toilet paper. These were soaked in vinegar between uses. You might imagine, a Roman soldier's most feared duty was leading a charge that. It wasn't that, it was latrine maintenance, clearing blockages, scrubbing the seats, managing the trench flow with shovels. These tasks rotated through the roster like clockwork. Failure to do them properly could result in more than just punishment. It could lead to outbreaks of disease, especially in tightly packed GARRSONS. And so, one man's duty kept 100 others from dysentery. Clean hands, clean tools, and regular vinegar rinses were their only defenses against a world that didn't yet know about bacteria, but learned about illness all too often. Letters and literacy, a paper, trail across the empire among the most extraordinary discoveries. At Vindolanda and other Romang, forts are letters, dozens of them, scratched into thin wooden tablets with ink and stylus. They're not political orders or military secrets. They're incredibly normal. I have sent you a parcel with some socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and underwear. I am sending this letter with the hope you will write soon. It is lonely here. Please send more ink and writing materials. Many soldiers were literate, at least functionally. Some learned on the job. Others were assigned as scribes, record keepers, or messengers. Writing offered a release, a chance to think beyond the walls, beyond the mud dot. It was the Roman army's way of staying human. Receiving a letter perhaps once a month, maybe less, was a moment of joy. Some read them aloud. Others hid them away, folded tightly inside bags, returning to the same words again and again. The empire stretched across 3 continents, but a piece of home fit in the palm of a soldier's hand. Repairs, drills, and downtime afternoons were for chores and drills. Always something to repair. Wall sections cracked by rain roofs of sod and timber, collapsing under snowstone paths, worn by endless marching feet if things were quiet. Soldiers drilled with wooden weapons, practiced formations, or cleaned there. Gear again. During downtime, they played dice, carved figurines, or engaged in board games like La Trunculia, Roman military strategy game. Some fletched arrows. Others wrote poems, scratched graffiti, or composed short prayers to household gods. Soldier might not fight in a major battle for his entire 20-year career, but he would dig, repair, clean, stand guard, and walk patrol more times than he could count. The work was constant, the repetition numbing, but it was this relentless routine that made the Roman army so durable. Evening, watch and final fires evenings, were colder in the forts than most places. Fires were lit again. Carefully managed to avoid burning too hot wood was always in short supply. Dinner was more of the same. Porridge, beans, maybe a bit of pork or smoked fish if someone had been lucky at market. Afterward, each contubernium settled down. Soldiers mended their socks by firelight, talked about nothing in particular, and tried not to think about the next morning. Guards rotated every few hours. Watch duty could mean standing on a foggy rampart, straining to see anything beyond torchlight, or sitting at the edge of the latrine pit, listening to the wind. If anything moved, if anything shifted in the trees, they had to be ready. But usually, nothing did dot, and so the soldier stood in silence, shifting his weight from foot to foot, breathing in the smell of damp stone and old straw. The silent pillars of an empire. What is an empire, if not a collection of shared chores? The Roman world was held together not only by generals and governors, but by thousands of men who did the same dull tasks every day, who kept warm with scraps of wool, who cleaned communal latrines, who stirred boiling lentils and repaired broken hinges. They may not have seen themselves as architects of history, but without them, the legions wouldn't move. The walls wouldn't stand. The republic turned empire would never have crossed the Alps or lingered in Britannia. When archaeologists dig up Roman forts, they find no great treasures. They find boots, spoons, tent pegs, dice, buckets, socks. Find the quiet heroes of maintenance. Next time you imagine a Roman soldier, try not to picture him on the battlefield. Picture him by the fire, needle in hand, patching a torn sock, preparing for another cold morning. Story 5. The Imperial Stamp. How Chinese bureaucrats filed tax forms by candlelight. Section 1. The brush, the seal, and the endless paperwork of the Han Dynasty. You are in a long corridor. The walls are brick, the floors earthen. There are no grand paintings, no golden statues. Just rows of men hunched over narrow tables, ink-stained fingers gripping thin brushes. The scent of burnt oil and fresh paper floats in the air. This is not a palace. This is a Han Dynasty office. And this is where the empire truly lived. In the flickering quiet of administrative buildings across China's vast provinces, clerks, scribes, and minor magistrates built the backbone of imperial rule, not with weapons, but with brush strokes. Line after line of tax documents, land surveys, grain records, and local complaints. Hundreds of thousands of documents, created by men who never made it into history books. This is their story, not of conquest or rebellion, but of bureaucracy, the dull, endless, meticulous work that sustained an empire of 60 million people. 4. Over 4 centuries. The rise of red tape in ancient China. By 200 BCE, the Han Dynasty had risen from the ashes of the short-lived Qin Empire. Unlike the Qin, who ruled with brutal centralization, the Han embraced a blend of central power and local administration. To govern such a vast and diverse land, they needed more than soldiers. They needed scribes, thousands of them. At the heart of Han governance was the civil service, a growing class of educated men trained in Confucian ethics, calligraphy, and record-keeping. Though the full-scale examination system wouldn't appear until later dynasties, even early Han rulers valued literacy and legal knowledge. At the lowest levels were Xi'an officials, county clerks responsible for tax collection, census data, land registry, and local law enforcement. They were neither rich nor powerful, but they were essential. Their most valuable tools? A bamboo-handled brush, often trimmed to a fine, flexible tip, a stone ink slab, carefully ground each morning with soot and water, a stack of thin paper sheets, handmade from mulberry bark or hempe red wax seal, the symbol of office authority. With these, they ruled the world of paperwork. A day in the life of a Han clerk. It is early morning in a county yamen, a government office. A clerk arrives with his satchel. Inside are folded documents, brush tools, and a soft rag for cleaning ink. He bows to the magistrate, then takes his place among the others. Already, the day's stack of work awaits tidy bundles of bamboo slips, string-tied forms, and partially filled census ledgers. First task: tax tallies. The last month's grain collection must be recorded. Names of households, acreage farmed, amount delivered, amount owed, each character written slowly with balance and symmetry. Errors meant discipline. Too many errors meant reassignment or worse. By midday, his fingers are numb. He dips the brush again, writes carefully, listens as others whisper updates about court cases or wandering officials. Runner arrives from a village 30 li away. His message is folded and stamped, an update on cattle numbers and a local flood. It's logged into the registry and filed into a scroll cabinet, cross-referenced with earlier weather reports. The clerk stretches, rubs his eyes, and moves to the next file. There is no end to the forms. Paperwork is power. Control through counting to the average person. These details are dull. How much millet a farmer produces. How wide his plot is. Whether he owns 1 ox or 2. But to the Han government, this information meant stability. Every family was registered. Every plot of land measured. Every able-bodied male counted for tax. And military service. And so, control came not by sword, but by paper. Imagine managing an empire before computers. No calculators, no photocopiers. Just trained men in cold offices, copying 1 slip at a time, building mountains of data by hand, even. Disaster relief floods, droughts, locusts depended on these records. Officials couldn't request aid unless numbers were accurate. Poor documentation meant poor response. In this way, bureaucracy became a survival mechanism. Filing cabinets of the past, how records were stored today. We think of file cabinets and databases. In the Han, it was wooden pigeonhole shelves, bamboo, slip bundles, and rolled scrolls tied with string. Each county office had a carefully maintained archive, population registers, every household member, age and occupation, land tax documents, military service logs, judicial cases, imperial decrees. Copied by hand documents were stamped with clay seals, wrapped in cloth, and stored in labeled cubbies. Important records had to be recopied every few decades. To prevent decay, if a scroll was lost, the entire record could disappear. So archivists were just as crucial as writers. Their job was to safeguard the memory of the state. Scribes and stress. A thankless career, the romantic image of a scholar at work calm. Noble, wise is a far cry from the lives of many actual scribes. Work was repetitive. Hours were long. Offices were drafty in winter and sweltering in summer. Ink dried too fast in heat and smudged too easily in damp weather. Calligraphy wasn't just art, it was accountability. Sloppy writing could invalidate a document. Some clerks lost jobs or endured public scolding for poorly formed characters. Mistakes mattered. And yet, this career was a path upward, especially for sons of farmers. If you could read and write, if you could manage taxes or copy legal code, you might be appointed to a higher post. Still, most never advanced. They spent their lives copying names, dates, yields. And when they died, another clerk took their place and continued the writing. The human side of the system might imagine the system was cold and inhuman. But among the paperwork were real stories. Letters of petition from widows asking for tax relief. Requests from aging farmers to exempt their sons from military duty. Complaints about local magistrates taking bribes. Declarations of village marriages. Notices of new births and recorded deaths. Some clerks read these petitions with care. Some didn't, but all of them passed through human hands. Hands that grew sore. Hands that blotted ink with the edge of a sleeve. Hands that sealed fate with a press of red wax. As dusk settles over the county yamen, oil lamps flicker to life. The clerk sets down his brush, stretches his arms, and listens to the quiet shuffle of others finishing their work. He gathers his notes. The next day's forms are already stacked neatly. He walks home in silence, the night breeze lifting the corner of his robe. Behind him, a scroll is filed into a shelf that has not been emptied in 10 years. And so the Han Empire did not rule by force alone. It ruled by the steady, quiet brushstrokes of men who filed forms late into the night. Section 2. Inside the ledger. Taxes, corruption, and the quiet crisis of the Han bureaucracy. You wake to the faint clatter of a brush against an inkstone. It is not the start of a battlefield charge, nor a royal ceremony. It is just the beginning of another day in the county yamen and office, where thousands of lives are reduced to rows on a paper scroll. But today is different. Today, the numbers don't quite add up. The tax that fed the empire, and sometimes starved. At the heart of the Han bureaucracy was agricultural tax, the standard obligation of farmers to surrender a portion of their harvest to the state. This was usually paid in grain: wheat in the north, rice in the south, millet in the border regions. Roughly 1/30th to 1/15th of a family's harvest could be required, depending on location and season. On paper, the system was elegant, fair, predictable. In practice, it was anything but. Consider this. A scribe in a rural office tallies the grain deliveries for the past season. His records show that 40 households in his jurisdiction have each delivered 2 dough of millet. A dough was about 10 laters. But the warehouse contains significantly less than expected. The warehouse keeper blames poor harvests. The clerk, though, has spoken to farmers who reported full yields. Something isn't right. What's missing? Possibly a bit of shrinkage, or perhaps just poor math. Or perhaps, quietly, some of the grain has been siphoned upward by local overseers, redistributed unofficially, or traded to merchants at a discount. And so begins the subtle dance between paper and reality. The corruption embedded in the system, corruption in the Han bureaucracy, did not always wear the face of bold crime. It often came in smaller, quieter forms: over-reporting household sizes to extract more taxes, under-reporting land acreage for a family favored by an official. Ghost names dead individuals who still appeared in the census, useful for pocketing, extra tax relief or resources, bribes disguised as gifts: a side of pork, a bolt of silk, a loan never repaid. Many magistrates were not born wealthy. Their salaries were modest. A certain amount of informal income was, in practice, expected. But to the scribes recording it all, the paper trail had to appear clean. It was the job of these clerks not to eliminate corruption, but to navigate it without drawing attention, carefully balancing numbers, smoothing over discrepancies, and ensuring the ledgers passed scrutiny from traveling inspectors. After all, if the papers were neat and the seals were stamped, the central government had little reason to investigate. Traveling inspectors, fear in fine robes every few years. A central inspector and emissary from this capital would arrive unannounced to audit a district office. Their arrival triggered mild panic. Clerks scrambled to organize files. Old scrolls were re-inked. Ledgers were reviewed for inconsistencies. If discrepancies were found: missing tax records, unread petitions, delayed court cases, the consequences could be dire. Demotion or dismissal of the magistrate, fines for the office beatings for lower staff in rare cases, execution for fraud. Some inspectors were ruthless. Others were just as corrupt as those they inspected. One famous Han-era quote declared, "An honest inspector is feared more than a corrupt official." And so, in the weeks before an inspector's visit, you might see more oil lamps burning late into the night, not out of devotion to duty, but out of fear. How a bad harvest became a bureaucratic crisis. Take the year 32 BCE, during the reign of Emperor Cheng of Han. That spring, early frosts in the north destroyed much of the millet crop. Farmers petitioned for tax relief. Local clerks noted the damage and filed reports. But in many counties, the loss was underreported. Why? Some magistrates feared looking incompetent. Others worried they wouldn't be able to deliver their expected tax quotas. A few simply didn't believe the villagers. So they submitted normal tax records to the central office, which meant grain requisition. Orders were not adjusted. Storage depots expected deliveries that wouldn't come. When grain fell short, the central government accused local officials of theft. Suddenly, what began as a natural disaster became a crisis of administration. Clerks were beaten. Some magistrates were arrested. A few villages went hungry for months before the truth caught up with the paperwork. This wasn't sabotage. This was a system built on paper certainty, clashing with real-world unpredictability. Census. Counts and the fear of vanishing. The Han Empire conducted some of the earliest known nationwide censuses, with the earliest record from 02 CE, reporting over 57 million people, a number not surpassed again until the Ming Dynasty, over 1,200 years. Later, but how accurate was that? Each household was required to report number of adults, number of children, land ownership, livestock count, males eligible for labor or military service. Some people underreported to avoid conscription. Some overreported to receive more grain during relief. Others simply lied, and the clerks overworked, underpaid, had to sort through it all. Imagine standing before a peasant family, their children shyly hiding behind the door, their mother insisting 2 sons had gone to the capital. The scribe suspects they're hiding in the hills to avoid forced service. He has no proof. So he writes down what he's told, and the state's grand statistics are nudged ever so slightly off mark. The mountains of paper, storage, decay, and loss. By the time a document reached a provincial archive, it had often been copied several times by hand. The original might remain in the county office, but copies would be sent to district headquarters, to provincial governors, and sometimes to the capital in Chang'an. As decades passed, these copies would fade, crumble, or mold. Offices developed rotation schedules. Every 10 to 20 years, key documents were recopied to preserve their content. And worn-out scrolls were ceremonially burned, sometimes during festivals. Some counties buried archives in clay jars to preserve them from fire. Still, countless documents vanished, forever lost to mildew, rats, rebellion, or simply being misplaced. One scribe in 09 CE recorded that his district had no records of a certain tax year due to a thunderbolt having destroyed the East Archive. Lightning. As good a scapegoat as any. The quiet resistance. When paper pushed back, not all clerks obeyed blindly. Some refused to forge numbers. Some hid evidence of local abuses. Few even inserted messages into official scrolls, small phrases, written between the lines, addressed not to superiors, but to history. The people here suffer greatly. The harvest failed, but our Lord reported it whole. I fear we will be blamed. We know of these because a few survived. A clerk in the southern commandery of Yuzhou once slipped a note into a rice inventory. These numbers are for the emperor's eyes, but not his ears. A cry, quiet and unheard, hidden in plain sight. So, in the late hours of the Han bureaucracy, beneath layers of rules, stamps, and ceremonial bows, there existed a subtle rebellion. The power of the pen to obscure, or to reveal, one careful line at a time. But what happened when the paperwork finally collapsed under its own weight? What happened when even the brush and seal couldn't hold the empire together? Section 3. Collapse by quill, the paperwork that couldn't save the Han Dynasty. Year is 184 CE. The quiet scratching of ink against bamboo has slowed. The ledgers still exist, and the county offices are still staffed, but they are brittle now, like a scroll left too long in the sun. And while the records continue to circulate, something has shifted. The bureaucracy, once the skeletal structure of the Han Dynasty, is starting to creak. Yellow turbans and paperwork panic when the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted in 184 CE. The first reflex of the local offices was not to call in troops. It was to start filing reports. County magistrates drafted urgent pleas to their provincial governors. Governors compiled their own summaries and dispatched envoys to the imperial capital. In some regions, clerks dug up old rosters of conscripted men to raise militias. In others, they issued emergency tax exemptions to placate villagers and dissuade them from joining the rebels. But this was not an age of real time. Communication. It could take weeks or months for a message to reach Chang'an. And by the time a response arrived, the village might already be burned or fully under rebel control. In effect, the bureaucratic machinery was too slow for rebellion, too procedural for chaos. And so, in the early years of the empire's decline, the quill became a tragic symbol not of order, but of helplessness. When tax records went silent as rebellion spread, the flow of information stalled. In the northern commanderies of Qing and Qi, entire tax districts ceased to report. Clerks fled. Magistrates were either killed or abandoned their posts. Scribes who once carefully inked population ledgers were now hiding among the farmers they once taxed. The central government attempted to send relief. It issued edict after edict, granting land amnesties, delaying taxes, restructuring counties. But these orders often arrived to empty offices. In Chang'an, frustrated officials updated maps of the empire with blank patches, territories now beyond the emperor's administrative reach. And in those blank patches, paper meant little. The bureaucracy had always existed by consent, by habit, and by ritual. Once that trust frayed, the ledgers turned to dust in all but name. The clerks who stayed behind, yet not everyone fled. In the interior provinces, particularly in the south, where rebellion was less immediate, many county clerks remained, not out of loyalty, but from inertia. Their routines continued even as the empire above them buckled. A remarkable example survives in the form of a bamboo scroll from Runnan Commandery, dated roughly to 187 CE. It contains population counts for 71 households' annotations, noting several deaths due to plague winds, grain tax tallies, some marked with red ink, likely indicating payment received. A marginal note, bandits spotted west of the river, unconfirmed. Even as the world burned beyond the county line, the scribe recorded births, deaths, and taxes. There is something haunting about this. In the middle of imperial collapse, these bureaucrats continued writing, not because they believed it would change anything, but because they knew nothing else. The pen had become a shield, however thin. The fragmented bureaucracy by 190 CE, the Han bureaucracy, had become a patchwork. Some counties were still fully operational, filing scrolls to regional governors. Others had been absorbed by warlords, who installed their own clerks and seal keepers. The official Han documents became mixed with local decrees. Stamps were forged, seals replaced, names crossed out, and rewritten in unfamiliar hands. In one case, an entire provincial treasury was seized by a local warlord who continued sending tax updates to the capital, updates that were fully fictional. For 3 years, the imperial court believed the region was stable. The lies were so bureaucratically convincing that even an investigative team dispatched from Chang'an was fooled, until they tried to locate the magistrate, who had died months earlier. In the end, the empire was no longer a single administration. It was dozens of overlapping paper systems, each pretending to be official. The meaning of a seal, much of the Han administrative structure, revolved around one small, easily overlooked item: the official seal. Seals, often made of bronze or jade, were used to authenticate every document: a tax order from a governor, a military dispatch, a village petition, a population register. Without the seal, a document was worthless. This meant that the seal was power itself. As chaos spread, stealing, forging, or simply possessing a seal became the difference between legitimacy and obscurity. In one case, a local strongman assassinated a Han tax official and took his seal. Not to loot the treasury, but to issue his own tax exemptions under imperial authority. The state, reduced to a stamp, the bureaucracy that outlived the empire, and yet, remarkably, the Han bureaucracy didn't vanish with the Han. Even as the dynasty fractured, the basic habits of paperwork persisted. Warlords hired former Han clerks. Ledgers were still kept. Rice still flowed taxed and tracked by those who knew how to wield a brush and inkstone. When the Three Kingdoms period began, each emerging state Wei, Shu, and Wu built its administrative machinery not from scratch, but by adopting Han methods. The Han may have fallen politically, but its bureaucracy, its obsession with records, tallies, seals, and census forms became China's default language of governance for centuries to come. Even during the Tang and Song dynasties, over 700 years later, some administrative terms and formats used could be traced back to Han-era templates. The pens of low-ranking clerks had outlasted the emperors themselves. A brush in the dark. Imagine now, one last scribe dot. It is the year 220 CE. The Han dynasty officially ends this year. But in a small southern county, where news travels slowly, the office lamp still burns. The scribe, now old, maybe half-blind, dips his brush into the inkstone and updates the harvest report. Outside, children play unaware that dynasties are changing. Inside, the final strokes of a dying empire are recorded not in fire or blood, but with quiet, steady writing on bamboo slips dot. So in the end, the fall of the Han wasn't a single crash, but a gradual paperwork failure, a soft, flickering decline written in worn calligraphy, stored in dusty archives, stamped with fading seals dot. And perhaps the empire didn't vanish after all. It was merely filed away.